What's your trouble?
I just can't stand seeing people killed, so
Did you see people killed?
lots of them.
What?
Lots of them.
Where did this happen?
The front. And they got the men on a forward slope. Germans start shelling them. A truck. Didn't get out. I was lucky enough to get under the bridge. And the shelling quieted down. I just went crazy and I ran away. Dead.
What?
Dead.
Dead what?
Dead people. Can't stand seeing them.
I can't hear you.
Can't stand seeing dead people.
Military historian Richard Gabriel tells us that in every war in which American soldiers have fought in this century, the chances of becoming a psychiatric casualty, of being debilitated for some period of time as a consequence of the stresses of military life, were greater than the chances of being killed by enemy fire. During World War II, more than 800,000 men were classified 4F, unfit for military service, due to psychiatric reasons.
How long haven't you been feeling well?
Despite this effort to weed out those mentally and emotionally unfit for combat, America's armed forces lost an additional 504,000 men from the fighting effort because of psychiatric collapse, enough to man 50 divisions. At one point in World War II, psychiatric casualties were being discharged from the U.S. Army faster than new recruits were being drafted in. In the brief 1973 Arab-Israeli War, almost a third of all Israeli casualties were due to psychiatric causes, and the same seems to have been true among the opposing Egyptian forces. In the 1982 incursion into Lebanon, Israeli psychiatric casualties were twice as high as the number of dead. World War II studies determined that after 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of all surviving soldiers will have become psychiatric casualties of one kind or another. Studies also found a common trait among the 2% who are able to endure sustained combat: a predisposition toward aggressive psychopathic personalities. The British in World War I believed that their soldiers were good for several hundred days before inevitably becoming a psychiatric casualty. But this was only made possible by the British policy of rotating men out of combat for 4 days of rest after approximately 12 days of combat, as opposed to America's World War II policy of leaving soldiers in combat for up to 80 days at a stretch. It is interesting to note that spending months of continuous exposure to the stresses of combat is a phenomenon found only on the battlefields of this century. Even the years-long sieges of previous centuries provided ample respites from combat, largely due to limitations of artillery and tactics. The actual times of personal risk were seldom more than a few hours in duration. Some psychiatric casualties have always been associated with war, but it is only in this century that our physical and logistical capability to sustain combat has completely outstripped our psychological capacity to endure it. The manifestations of psychiatric casualties. Fatigue cases. This state of physical and mental exhaustion is one of the earliest symptoms. Increasingly unsociable and overly irritable, the soldier loses interest in all activities with comrades and seeks to avoid any responsibility or activity involving physical or mental effort. He becomes prone to crying fits or fits of extreme anxiety or terror. There will also be such somatic symptoms as hypersensitivity to sound, increased sweating, and palpitations. Such fatigue cases set the stage for further and more complete collapse. If the soldier is forced to remain in combat, such collapse becomes inevitable. The only real cure is evacuation and rest. Confusional states. Fatigue can quickly shift into the psychotic disassociation from reality that marks confusional states. Usually, the soldier no longer knows who he is or where he is. Unable to deal with his environment, he has mentally removed himself from it. Symptoms include delirium, psychotic disassociation, and manic-depressive mood swings. One often noted response is Ganzer Syndrome, in which the soldier will begin to make jokes, act silly, and otherwise try to ward off the horror with humor and the ridiculous. Conversion hysteria. Conversion hysteria can occur traumatically during combat or post-traumatically years later. Conversion hysteria can manifest itself as an inability to know where one is or to function at all, often accompanied by aimless wandering around the battlefield with complete disregard for evident dangers. Upon occasion, the soldier becomes amnesiatic, blocking out large parts of his memory. Often hysteria degenerates into convulsive attacks in which the soldier rolls into the fetal position and begins to shake violently. Gabriel notes that during both world wars, cases of contractive paralysis of the arm were quite common, and usually the arm used to pull the trigger was the one that became paralyzed. A soldier may become hysterical after being knocked out by a concussion, after receiving a minor, non-debilitating wound, or after experiencing a near miss. Hysteria can also show up after a wounded soldier has been evacuated to a hospital or rear area. Once he is there, hysteria can begin to emerge, most often as a defense against returning to fight. Whatever the physical manifestation, it is always the mind that produces the symptoms in order to escape or avoid the horror of combat. Anxiety states. These states are characterized by feelings of total weariness and tenseness that cannot be relieved by sleep or rest, degenerating into an inability to concentrate. When he can sleep, the soldier is often awakened by terrible nightmares. Ultimately, the soldier becomes obsessed with death and the fear that he will fail or that the men in his unit will discover that he is a coward. Generalized anxiety can easily slip into complete hysteria. Another reaction which is commonly seen in Vietnam veterans suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, years after combat is emotional hypertension, in which the soldier's blood pressure rises dramatically with all the accompanying symptoms of sweating, nervousness, and so on. Obsessional and compulsive states. These states are similar to conversion hysteria, except that here the soldier realizes the morbid nature of his symptoms and that his fears are at their root. Even so, his tremors, palpitations, stammers, tics, and so on cannot be controlled. Eventually, the soldier is likely to take refuge in some type of hysterical reaction that allows him to escape psychic responsibility for his physical symptoms. Character disorders. Character disorders include obsessional traits in which the soldier becomes fixated on certain actions or things, paranoid trends accompanied by irascibility, depression, and anxiety often taking on the tone of threats to his safety, schizoid trends leading to hypersensitivity and isolation, epileptoid character reactions accompanied by periodic rages, the development of extreme dramatic religiosity, and finally, degeneration into a psychotic personality. What has happened to the soldier is an altering of his fundamental personality. These are only some of the possible symptoms of psychiatric casualties in war. Gabriel notes that the mind has shown itself infinitely capable of bringing about any number of combinations of symptoms and then, to make matters worse, burying them deep in the soldier's psyche so that even the overt manifestations become symptoms of deeper symptoms of even deeper underlying causes. Nations customarily measure the cost of war in dollars, lost production, or the number of soldiers killed or wounded. Rarely do military establishments attempt to measure the cost of war in terms of individual human suffering. Psychiatric breakdown remains one of the most costly items of war when expressed in human terms. Richard Gabriel. No More Heroes.